Hi, welcome to the presentation. My name is Adil Oran from the Middle East Technical University Department of Business Administration. Today, I will be giving a brief presentation on why entrepreneurship is important as a subject and why it's important that you also get to learn more about entrepreneurship. So let's begin. So why entrepreneurship? Why is it important? Well, first of all, over the years, the importance of entrepreneurship, the role of entrepreneurship within economies has been growing. I will be giving numbers from the Turkish economy. However, these numbers are quite similar to most OECD countries. For example, in number of firms, entrepreneurship and small, medium-sized enterprises are also commonly used interchangeably. They're not quite the same. However, they do interact, they do overlap quite a bit. So I will give details a little later on. But first, let me tell you a little bit about the important role of these SMEs in economies. First of all, in number of firms, 99.8% of firms by number in the Turkish economy are small and medium-sized entities. So the large companies that typically we think of when we mention corporations, those form only a minuscule part of the number of companies out there. So yes, acceptable that these companies are much larger than the others, and therefore, when we take a weight of their importance, they may move up a little bit, but still, the SMEs have huge weight in the economies that they operate within. And of these SMEs, obviously there's small and medium sized, and then we said the large companies as well. So if the large are only 0.2%, what's the rest, this 99.8? Well, of that 99.8, most of them are small companies. So in excess of 95%, probably significantly higher, are small companies and even micro companies, which is a subset of the small companies. So micro companies would have between 0 to 10 employees. Small companies, basically anything from 0 to 50 employees. And 50 to 250 is our medium-sized companies, and companies that have more than 250 employees fall into the large group. There's also separations of this done according to asset value size, sales numbers, and so on. But most often you will probably hear the differentiation done according to number of employees. So if the SMEs form so many of the companies, do they have equivalent roles in the other measures of the economy as well? For example, how about the number of jobs that are created? These large companies versus SMEs, which ones carry greater weight? Well, you might say, oh, well, it's only 0.2%, but keep in mind, some of these companies may have many hundreds, thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of employees. So they will carry greater weight. But still, SMEs in the Turkish economy constitute about 3/4 of the total jobs in the economy. How about sales revenue? How much of the sales are in the hands of small and medium companies versus large companies? Well, in sales, yes, the number goes down a little bit, but still about 2/3 of the sales generated in an economy come from the SMEs, and about 1/3 from the large companies. If we come to exports, initially, before I began to develop this interest in entrepreneurship and SMEs, I used to think, oh, well, the large companies are obviously the more important ones. But even in exports, what one country sells to the rest of the world, in Turkey currently changes a little from year to year, but 50%, a little more than 50% still comes from SMEs. So regardless of what you're looking at, SMEs play an important role in these things. So it's been increasing over time. And not just in absolute numbers, but also if you have targets of growth. If you want your economy to be getting bigger, if you want it to play a more important role in the world, then the importance of SMEs and new SMEs that are being formed and entrepreneurship starts to increase significantly. Because most of the growth in economies does not necessarily come from big established old companies. Big old established companies typically may have grown rapidly in the past, but have probably slowed down. They have to slow down. You can't continue to grow forever. So if you have growth aspirations, the role that SMEs are going to have to play is very important in your economies, especially if you want to create not just more sales, but jobs. There's interesting research out there which examines job creation by different types of companies. There's a study by the Kaufman Foundation, I think covering 1980 to 2005. There's a number of other studies for many countries around the world. But that Kaufman study that I mentioned finds that during the 25 years from 80 to 2005, the number of net jobs created. What do we mean by net jobs? Well, every year you hire new people, but you also have people that are retiring, that get fired, etc. So the difference between these, the number of net jobs created by large companies in the US economy was basically zero. Every year they hire people, but every year they have people that retire. And anytime that these large companies find that they have difficulties in their economic conditions, they will do something to increase efficiency. That's a code word for, what is efficiency? You can do the same thing with less resources or use those resources to generate more value. Typically, what happens is to become more efficient, these companies will cut part of their labor force. And the cuts in the labor force may be, 5%, 10% of their global labor force. And that means a lot of people losing their jobs. So over the 25 years in the US economy, the large companies have not been creating the net new jobs. So does this mean no jobs have been created in the US economy? Well, their unemployment rate is very low and their population has been increasing. So obviously new jobs must have been created. The problem is that it wasn't the old large companies that were creating these. The research shows that the jobs were created by new SMEs that were established and found success and then began to grow rapidly. Over time, they might grow out of their small, medium-sized into the large portions, but even when that happens, they tend to slow down. So it was the young SMEs which were creating the jobs in the US economy. Other studies, for example, there was one I read on the Austrian economy. There, they did not attribute all of the growth in jobs to the small companies, but they had, I think, about 1/3 coming from the large companies. But again, more than half, about 2/3 were coming from the small and medium-sized entities. So in most of the countries around the world, we see similar things. It's not just the large companies which are necessary to create growth, to create new jobs. Very important roles fall onto entrepreneurs and the SMEs that they are establishing. Not all of them create equal value. There's actually a small subgroup which have the greatest effect. The vast majority of them, maybe 95%, yes, they get established, they create, a few jobs. Many of them stay at that level. But there's a small subset, probably less than 5%, 3% seems to be the overall estimates, which are the ones which are undertaking high growth potential entrepreneurship. And they are the ones that create innovation. And they are the ones which, if successful, they're the ones which start to grow rapidly and create the vast majority of those jobs we're talking about. So for innovation-based entrepreneurship, there's a very important role in all economies around the world. When I was doing a little research for another speech that I was going to give, one of the things I was looking at was, I was going to make a statement about, World War III and what it might be, its potential reasons. And I ran into this figure. I didn't like it very much because, I teach in Turkey, I'm Turkish. So countries most likely to start World War III, and up at the very top, yes, United States, yes, then Russia, yeah, obviously, but Turkey at number 3. Yes, I believe Turkey, it has an important role, is an important country, but most likely to start World War III, that was scary. This is not something that I enjoy. And when we look at the rest of them, countries like Egypt, Syria, Iran, Pakistan, India, China, North Korea, it's not a group of countries that I necessarily enjoy being within. But it was kind of a wake-up call. What I actually wanted to mention about World War III is, let's hope it never happens. There's a famous quote by Albert Einstein. He says, I don't know, I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought with, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. Why? Because, well, if nuclear weapons are used and if it goes global, then we probably will, it will create great problems to the rest of the world, and technology will go back, and we might not even survive it as the world. So that's World War III. But what I wanted to show about this is I wanted to ask you, what the potential reason that World War III might be. Many people often state things like, oh, it's going to be about oil or some type of other natural resources. It's going to be about water, clean water. It's going to be about, food shortages and, things like this. But some people argue that it's actually going to be about jobs. There's actually even a book that was written about this in 2011 called The Coming Jobs War. And it was written by Jim Clifton, the chairman of Gallup Research. And in that book, he showed that, the thing that people care most about is, having a job, having a good, well-paying job. And this is not just in any particular country, but all around the world, people care about these. And when this begins to be threatened by whatever things going on around the world, this creates a lot of problems. And it creates, maybe the potential for countries to go to war with each other if they start stealing jobs away from each other. And a lot of things like this have been happening. So yes, jobs is going to be a very important problem in many countries around the world, if not all countries around the world. If we come to Turkey, I want to ask you, what do you think Turkey's most valuable resource is? If we were sitting in class, I would spend more time on this. Well, we typically get answers like, okay, hazelnuts, raisins, or borium. Yes, these are things that we have, a relatively large portion of the world's stock in, but none of these by itself really, I think, is Turkey's most valuable resource. Some people argue, and I tend to agree, that Turkey's most valuable resource is actually our population, and in particular, our young population. So we have this young population which can help us create value and be an important player in the world economy, in the world. And why is having a young population important? Well, let's take a look at the population pyramid of Turkey. A healthy population pyramid looks like a pyramid. It has a fat base and relatively narrow at the top. And what we see here is that even if not, it's quite a pyramid, it's gotten a little narrower at the bottom, it's still a relatively healthy shape. At the very bottom, we have those that are still in school, in education, but after a while, these go out into the world and they start creating economic value and they pay taxes. And it is thanks to this value that they help generate, which the rest of the economy, the rest of the population is also able to survive at a healthy level. So that's what we need to survive. This group of people working, generating value, paying taxes, which allows the people that, aren't working yet, or the portions that have retired, to be able to survive, to be able to, still have a healthy economy. And ours overall isn't bad. But some other countries, some other regions, not so well. For example, if we take a look at Europe, Western Europe, we see that their pyramid kind of has at the bottom become, inverse. So they probably will have difficulty when this narrow part becomes the dominant part generating value, and a lot more people start living longer and retire and are no longer generating value. And this is something which they need to worry about. And this is one of the reasons that Western Europe also needs immigrants to help come in and stabilize their economies, help them continue to grow. Some other places, even more problems, like in Japan, they have this interesting kind of two levels where they kind of have these, but the overall thing that we see is at the bottom, they don't have enough young population to help them continue to support this indefinitely. One of the things that they do to deal with this is they have much more automation, they have much more robotics in their production and things to kind of alleviate this problem of not having enough people to be able to take over those jobs. But still, this is probably going to create significant problems for them. So that's one place where we have an advantage over these other countries or regions. But I also want to ask you about Turkey's most important problem. What do you think it is? These days, obviously, inflation and safety are also big concerns. But you know what? A lot of people, again, agree that Turkey's most important problem, that thing that was our big advantage, is also our biggest problem, because this is what a big chunk of that population is actually doing currently, looking for jobs, trying to find a job. For a single job application availability, you have hundreds of people applying to each of those jobs, and this is a big problem, and it can create a lot of social problems as well. So here is a number. It's a little old now, 2015, but these are 15 to 29-year-olds, which are currently not in employment, education, or training. These are called NEET, N-E-E-T, not in employment, education, or training. And this is a graph which we are at the top of, but we don't want to be at the top of a graph like this. Notice that adding together the inactive and unemployed, official unemployment numbers don't necessarily mean that those are the only people that don't have jobs. Here, this tells us that, 30%, and this is, about 7 years ago, about 30% of our 15 to 29-year-olds, which were out of education and other types of training, but had not been able to find jobs. And here are some other figures. Okay, so this is for the European Union from Eurostat. The overall average is 16.5 for the EU of 20 to 34-year-olds not in employment, education, or training. And Turkey over here is, above 30%, 33%. So yes, at least a third, probably even more, of our young population, that valuable asset, is not being used. So this is a problem. This creates social unrest for those people that don't have the jobs. And it's also a valuable resource which is being underutilized. So what can we do about it? And the problem isn't exactly symmetric either. If we look at men versus women, so again, EU average, around here for men, what is that, 12%, but for women above 20%. And again, if we look at Turkey, about 25% for men, but for women, it's above 50%. So this unemployment problem or NEET problem is very, very important, especially for young women. And we need to think about what we can do to alleviate, to improve this. Another thing which is a problem is of the population that you have that you're trying to employ, it's also important to train them well, to teach them well. Now, here's a number which shows us that we might not be doing a very good job in training them either. So down here at the bottom this time, again, the place we don't want to be, is the percentage of people lacking basic skills. Okay, so basic reading, basic literacy, and mathematics, numeracy skills. In Japan, it's less than 5% that lacks this. This time, it's not just for the young, but for the general population, 15 to 65-year-olds. And this OECD figure tells us that, again, close to 40% of our population lacks basic skills. So even if you try to hire them, their skills are problematic as well. So we need to find a way to make sure that we both train our population and our youth well, and then also are able to find jobs for them. Now, let's develop a little more terminology to help us understand things. Entrepreneurship animals. What animals come to your mind when you hear the word entrepreneurship? Well, let me give you some numbers since we're not able to interact directly in this presentation. One word that you should learn is unicorn, or in Turkish, tek boynuzlu. Okay, so a unicorn is a company which is not traded on an organized exchange, but has reached a valuation of $1 billion plus. Okay, so a unicorn. And these kind of are mythical. They don't exist or almost don't exist. There's very few of them, even though in the last years, the number of unicorns around the world has risen significantly. If you're interested in these, type into Google, unicorn, which will take you probably to the CB Insights website, where you can take a look at, how many there are, what countries they're from, and what these unicorns do. And you will run into even a few Turkish companies which have joined this unicorn list. And recently, we've actually even come up with a new definition called a decacorn. Okay, these are companies, again, privately held companies or startups, which have a valuation of more than $10 billion. Most recently, last week, Getir became a decacorn with a valuation of close to $12 billion in its latest round. So the term is becoming increasingly popular. Other animals you probably want to learn about, and some which I think might be even more important. We have gazelles, ceylan. So gazelles are companies which are young and fast moving. And in the definition says they should be at the starting point, they should have sales of at least $1 million per year. And then for at least 4 years in a row, grow at least 20% each year. And this allows them to, from a decent starting point, to achieve significant growth, significant numbers. So gazelles are not mythical. There are a lot of gazelles out there. And I think as an aim, a gazelle might be more realistic. Okay, so you might aim for the stars, unicorn, but just because you don't reach that doesn't mean you're not successful. I would rather have, 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 gazelles in the Turkish economy, in the ecosystem, than maybe one unicorn. Okay, because it spreads out much more the success, and what I want to see are the gazelles, some of which might eventually become unicorns and even decacorns. But the gazelles, they are able to survive consuming less resources, and they're able to act very quickly, adapting to changing market conditions as well. So that's they might not become $1 billion companies, but easily they'll become in the tens of millions or even 100 millions level. So I'd like to see more of these around. Another kind of new company which we have started to hear about are camels, especially as the economic conditions and the crisis have started to occur around the world. In some places, funding has become more of a problem, whereas in unicorns and gazelles, the investors used to put money in, spend it as quickly as possible so that you can become successful quickly and make money for us quickly. And meanwhile, some of them will run into the wall and die. That's just a fact of business. Some companies have said, well, the financing might not be as readily available as before, so we need to change how we behave. And camels, like the animals which is able to survive long periods of time without water or food, are companies which have found ways to survive longer periods with less resources, with less financing. So rather than spend the money as quickly as it comes, they find ways to spend the money more efficiently and be able to survive for longer periods of time without the new resources coming in automatically. And the nice thing about camels is that even though they can slow down and take it easy during the economic downturns, when an opportunity is observable in the market, they can still move quite rapidly to take advantage of those opportunities in the markets. So we're also seeing some of these in the economy as ways to become successful. So the definition that I use for entrepreneurship is kind of a derived definition, and it's not necessarily representing all entrepreneurs. I want to pay more attention to the entrepreneurs that have that potential to make a big difference. Remember, I said less than 5%, probably about 3% of startups, the high growth potential startups, which actually create the big growth in sales and in jobs and in other parts. I want to try to see whether we can identify these and whether we can find ways to help the people that are trying to undertake this type of entrepreneurship. So for them, the definition that I like to use is kind of derived from Eric Ries, the author of The Lean Startup. And when he was defining a startup, out of that, I drew this out. So an entrepreneur is somebody who's trying to develop a new product or service, makes sense, but they're doing this under conditions of high uncertainty, okay? So they're not just cloning what somebody else has done before, but they're doing this in an environment where sometimes you don't know who exactly is your customer, how many there are, what their problems are. You don't know how you're going to solve their problem. You don't know how you're going to produce it, how long it's going to take, how much it's going to cost. You don't know where you're going to sell your product. You don't know a lot of things. And that is an environment which can be quite dangerous for an entrepreneur. But if successful, that also creates an environment where there's a lot of potential for success. So this is the type of entrepreneurship that I'm interested in and that I try to help develop. And now I want to show you the logos for a number of companies. And these are the 20 most valuable companies. And I've been making this this kind of list for a while now. And actually, I've had to add 3 more onto this. So these are the most recent additions: Tesla, NVIDIA, and United Healthcare, to the 20 most valuable companies, largest market cap in the world. And actually, while I've been doing this for the last few years, these are the ones that have dropped out, okay, which are no longer in the top 20, Intel, Alibaba, MasterCard, Wells Fargo, and these companies. So when you see these companies, what comes to your mind? And, you know, oftentimes people would say stuff like, oh, success, oh, big, oh, technology, this, that. Well, you know what I see? I see in trouble. I see danger. Why? Because just because you have become big and successful in today's world, it no longer guarantees that you're going to stay big and successful for very long. And as evidenced by even all the changes that has happened in the last few years, this change is ongoing. It hasn't stopped. So these companies, in order to continue to be large and successful, are going to have to do some new things, are going to have to work very hard to keep their positions. There's a U2 song I like called Running to Stand Still. You know, yes, these companies have to run very fast just to stay in the same position, because if they stop running or if they slow down, other companies are going to come in and take over. So these companies have discovered that they need to continue to innovate. And one problem is that large companies find it difficult to innovate in a lot of ways because they become bureaucratic, they become like dinosaurs, they slow down. And it becomes difficult to innovate in these environments. So these companies have also developed an interest in entrepreneurship, except they changed the name to Intrapreneurship. This is entrepreneurship that is done within large companies or within state enterprises and stuff like this. So why are they interested in intrapreneurship, sometimes called corporate entrepreneurship? İç girişimcilik, şirket içi, kurum içi girişimcilik. So why are they interested in entrepreneurship? Well, it's kind of similar to why we should be interested in entrepreneurship in general. Again, if they want to grow, if they want to continue to grow, if they want to be able to innovate, if they want this, you know, innovation-based entrepreneurship, in general, it just to stay alive, stay successful, they need these entrepreneurs, because otherwise they're going to become stagnant and they're going to start to fall back. And the problem is that it's not easy to behave in an entrepreneurial way in a large company because, well, large companies and their cultures aren't very conducive to entrepreneurship, to risk-taking, to a lot of rapid changes. And as business schools, we're part of that problem as well, because we try to slow things down. We try to make it more, you know, planned out and so on. And that kills out some of the entrepreneurial reflexes that people have. And definitely, it's, again, we don't have symmetry. For example, if you do something entrepreneurial in a large company, if successful, you'll get a handshake, a thank you, maybe a bonus. But if you do something entrepreneurial, risky, and you're unsuccessful, you may get fired from that job. You may get tainted. Your future may be, you know, in jeopardy, at least at that company. And if you get fired, finding a new job may also be difficult. So in such an environment, you will see that most rational people will not behave very entrepreneurially. So large companies are trying to find ways that they can continue to generate entrepreneurs, which continue to make improvements, make changes. And we'll come back to this throughout the semester. So to also show you how things have been changing. So over the last 100 years, these are the largest companies. So 1917, 67, and 2017. And I just showed you the numbers for 2022. Notice that the companies and their industries and their makeup has been changing. And right now, we tend to see a domination of companies from the technology sector. And the valuations have also grown rapidly, but things are changing. So here's also the industries of these companies. So this is for the largest 50 companies. And, you know, in 1917, steel, oil and gas, mining, food seemed to dominate. But, you know, 50 years later, oil and gas is still up there, but technology, telecommunications, film, autos, all of those could be counted as technology related. But we see that while oil and gas is still important, steel has, you know, come down significantly, and then technology, telecommunications seems to be rising. And by the time we get to 2017, technology is dominating financial services, medical, conglomerate, telecom. So the makeup has kind of shifted, and oil and gas has fallen back, and that's where the world was. So over time, which industries, which companies dominate definitely changes. But you might say, hey, in 100 years, obviously it's going to change. Well, let's take a look at even shorter term. This is, you know, at about 5-year intervals, the top 5. And even here, we've been seeing changes, with GE dropping out, with oil coming and going, with international companies appearing, and then kind of a domination by this group, which you can call FAMGA, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and Apple. And even since 2016, things have changed a little bit. Their valuations had increased, you know, kind of doubled from where they were. Berkshire Hathaway kind of snuck in above Facebook, and this year, Aramco, you know, a few years Saudi Arabian oil, has jumped into the fray. Company valuations have risen above $2 trillion. And then kind of come back down. Tesla came in, Facebook kind of went down, but yes, things are continuing to change. But, you know, technology seems to have an important role to play, is what we can see. So I like to bring in sayings to help us remember important points of presentations. So here I want to bring in somebody from ancient Anatolia, Heraclitus from Ephesus. And he kind of had this obsession with change. So he's the one that I'm sure you've heard this in one way or another. You cannot step into the same river twice. You can't wash in the same river twice. So he said this, saying that just by getting into it and the water flowing down, it's not the same river, even if you go into it again. He also has the famous saying that change is the only constant. So yes, change is, you know, everlasting, right? It happens everywhere. However, what we've observed is that change seems to be increasing in speed. So Heraclitus' kind of equivalent in economics is Joseph Alois Schumpeter. And he had this idea of creative destruction, where he argued that in a capitalistic economy, the existing successful companies can't take it easy because other companies are going to come in. And even if the other companies' models or way of doing business has not failed, they will come in and try to take over. They will try to innovate, make changes to be able to take over their market. And they will, some of them won't win, but some of them will come in and take over the market share of these other companies. And, you know, this will create destruction. You know, even things that could still be valuable, ways of doing business, factories, some of these will be destroyed, will go bankrupt. And he also argued that this may end up creating the end of a capitalistic system, that it will end up destroying itself. I'm not certain about that. I don't totally agree with that. But this ongoing change, yes, definitely exists in economies. And let me show you some of the potential reasons why this change is happening, and is happening at a faster and faster pace. So this is a graph of the average company lifespan on the S&P 500. So how long have they been on the S&P 500? How long do we expect new companies coming in to remain on the S&P 500? In some places, this is misinterpreted as saying how long they will live, but this is how long they expect to stay in the S&P 500, not necessarily survival. So if you go back to the 1960s, the firms on the S&P 500, once you come in, you're expected to stay, 50, 60 years in there. So when you become big and successful, around the 1960s, you stayed big and successful for long periods of time. But even though there are kind of fluctuations, the overall trend is pretty clear, and it's downward pointing, right? So the trend here is definitely coming down. So there may be some, slight waves or cycles, but the overall trend can't be argued with. So by the time we came to the 2000s and later, the amount of time that you expected to stay on the S&P 500 had shrunk from around 50 years to less than 20 years, probably coming down to 10 years or less. So that basically shows us that just because you've become a big successful company doesn't mean you're going to stay there forever or even for very long. So this is one of the reasons why companies have noticed that they need to change, that they need to innovate, they need to continue to work very hard. This is another potential factor affecting this. How much does it cost to take an entrepreneurship idea, in this case, a technology-based idea, and establish a startup around that idea? Around 2000, CB Insights, with data from Upfront Ventures, argue that it cost about $5 million to launch a technology-based startup. And then time goes by and some changes occur in the market. Open source, horizontal scaling software and methods approaches, and basically took this cost of 5 million and cut it to 10%. So by 2005, this in Silicon Valley, it would cost you about $500,000 to have a startup around the technology-based idea. And then cloud and Amazon Web Services and these things came in, which meant that you didn't have to buy your own server and maintain it and so on. You could simply rent as much as you needed, which again took that cost and again cut it to 1/10. So by 2009, you needed about $50,000 to try your entrepreneurship technology idea. 2011, again, about 1/10, 5,000. So if this trend continues, right now it's either, should be about zero, or maybe they're starting to give you money to try your idea. Well, in Turkey, we have, for example, some support mechanisms which may allow you to use resources like the TÜBİTAK Big and other things if you have a technology-based idea. But yes, compared to 10, 20 years ago, it is relatively much cheaper and much easier to take an idea and try to form a startup around it. And what this has allowed is it has allowed many more people to try out their ideas. This doesn't mean they all survive, but of the people trying their ideas, so many people attempt it, and creative destruction, yes, some of these die out, but of the ones that are tried and end up becoming successful, they're the ones that end up making the big changes in the market and in the economies. So this has allowed many more successful startups to begin their journey. One other thing, these are called diffusion of innovation curves, and they're called S-shaped curves because they are shaped like the letter S. So this is how long it takes for a new technology to be adopted by a big portion of the people in that economy. And this is for the US, so US households percentage. And what we see, if you go back to the 1900s, things like the telephone, electricity, automobile, yes, it began to be accepted, then slowed down. And then it took, quite a bit of time, 50, 60 years for something to become mainstream, to become widely adopted. But as you come into, 1945, 60, 75, 1990, notice that the S shape is still there, but it has become much more narrow. So if you have a good idea and you try it, it's relatively cheaper. The market is willing to adopt these much more rapidly than in the past. So it means that successful ideas can take hold much more rapidly than before. So if you're one of the big successful companies, this may scare you. But if you're one of the new incoming technology-based startups, this is a nice potential for you to be able to grow quickly, rapidly, become very successful. So these forces acting together scare the large companies and provide ways for the small entrepreneurs to do things to become successful. So let's also define what we mean by innovation. Does it mean an invention? Well, an innovation is an implemented new idea, okay? And in particular, successfully implemented new idea is what we call an innovation. And when you have an environment which is constantly evolving, changing technology and this and that, organizations, in order not to get left behind, they need to be constantly innovating and trying to do this more and more quickly, more and more successfully. So this intrapreneurship trend is coming from this as well. There's many different types of innovation, product innovation, process innovation, business model innovation, which we will talk a lot about in my courses, because it's not just the product that can be improved. Where you sell it, how you produce it, how you market it, a lot of things other than just the product can be innovated, and this can create very successful companies. So we need to be aware of this. Incremental, small innovations versus radical, big innovations. And another important one is one introduced by Clayton Christensen, who passed away, unfortunately, in 2020. He was a professor at Harvard Business School, a professor of strategy and marketing, but he was a guru in innovation. In particular, disruptive innovation was his baby, or he was one of the people that helped it grow, not necessarily came up with the initial idea. But he says that, one of the separations can be sustaining versus disruptive innovations. And the idea was first introduced first in an article in 1995 in the Harvard Business Review, and then later as a book. And this was his also doctoral thesis work that he was examining this. And he basically was interested in this question. Why are some big successful companies, well-managed firms with a lot of resources that have, been very successful, how come these companies are unsuccessful in some types of innovation? So why do these firms become unable to adapt to some innovations and end up failing? And at the same time, how come some small firms with much less resources, how come they are able to successfully operate in those markets and take it over when the failure of these big ones happens? And so his separation was, he argued that, well, some companies, and large companies do this pretty well, you can be good at sustaining innovations, or sustaining technologies, he called it at that time. These are innovations which help the company sell to its existing customers again. So for example, I'm a laptop producer, seller, and I've been selling laptops. I have a good market share. I know my customers well. What kind of improvements can I make to sell to them next year and the year after that? I can make the laptop more powerful. I can make it a little lighter. I can make the screen bigger and smaller. So these are innovations which help me sell to my existing customers again. Whereas disruptive innovations or disruptive technologies are a little different. So let me try to explain those in the next few slides as well. But also after 95, the theory of disruptive innovation became very heard of in the markets. But after a while, some people argued that, no, it's not as clear cut as Christensen was making it sound to be. And actually, another professor from Harvard, Jill Lepore, she was from the history department, if I remember correctly, argued that actually his evidence did not support disruptive innovation and didn't explain it well, and wrote an article in the New Yorker. A few months later, another article came out in the MIT Sloan Review, and again argued that we might be misusing or misunderstanding this disruptive innovation. So they came back with some arguments in favor of it. So there was this renewed interest in disruptive innovation around 2015, about 20 years after it had originally come out. And it's been another 7 years since then. So let me try to help you understand quickly what disruptive innovation is and what it is not. Okay, so disruptive innovation. First, let's start out with the argument about what the market wants from a particular, product. And upon this scale, we have performance, so more performance, and here we have time. And over time, what the market wants, the amount of performance that the market wants tends to increase. Okay, so at this time, this is what the average market wants in performance, whatever this is. This could be computing speed. This might be, speed of the car. I don't know. It depends on the product, what that performance is. But what we need to keep in mind is that this, even though we say, this is the performance that the market wants, there's actually a distribution around that mean. So this might be at the average or the median of that demand, but there are a lot of people that want more or lower performance than this average. And over time, yes, it may be growing, but we oftentimes forget that there's this distribution and that this is not a single block of demand. So if we look at that graph more closely, yes, the majority of this demand may be in the middle. Okay, so we might say this is the kind of mainstream market, which is demanding that average level of performance. But we also need to keep in mind that there's other parts of this market which can also be accessed. There's some which actually want higher performance and probably might be willing to pay more for this improved performance. And then you also have some people which don't need that high level of performance. And if you could find a product which has that lower level of performance, especially if you sell it to them at a lower price, they might actually be more than willing to buy that. So back to the graph, yes, around this demand for performance, which is increasing over time, we need to keep in mind that there are these two additional lines showing us, reminding us that there is also demand on the upper side, on the high side of that average, and also at the lower side of that average demand for performance as well. So when you're trying to enter into this market and sell to this market, what portion are you going to target? Are you going to target the, the average, the mainstream market? Most companies do. Or are you going to be targeting the extremes, the upper part of the market, typically more profitable part of the market, or the lower side of this? Well, with technology, typically this is what we end up seeing. Technology for producing a particular product typically improves over time, allowing you to provide the market demand with the levels of performance that it wants. Initially, the technology might be below what the market wants, but with technological improvements, typically it catches up. And then sometimes, technology continues to improve pretty rapidly and may even overshoot the average of the market and might try to go towards the top level. And this happens in some markets where the products that the market is actually trying to sell is better than what the market wants or needs at that time. But because all of the products are heading in that direction, we typically find ways to, as long as it's not much more expensive than the others, we're willing to move up to that better performance that we have to have. We've seen this a lot of in computers and a lot of things. But here's where disruption takes place. Disruptive technologies come in like this. They come in at a level and at a time when the mainstream market is not satisfied by your product. So initially, this is the important point, most disruptive technologies initially are substandard. They're not very good. They're poor products with not very good performance. So they're not really able to satisfy the mainstream market, at least not initially. And for that reason, the dominant players in the market typically don't shift to this new technology. They continue with their existing technology being able to satisfy the market. And over time, they even tend to overshoot. But the problem for them is that some other companies which do go into this, typically these are new companies, small companies, which take on this disruptive technology, and the technological advancement of the new technology may be more rapid than the old existing technology. And as a result, over time, as the old technology tends to continue to increase and overshoot the mainstream market's demands, this may become sufficient for the mainstream, and over time it may even overtake the old technology, which is especially when the total disruption of the market happens. Initially, the old existing companies may retreat upstream to the more profitable upper side of the market demand, leaving the cheap customers and sometimes even the mainstream customers to the new technologies. But by this time, they typically end up losing even the upper part of the market. So that's when the disruption is set to become finalized. So this is the main argument that was present in the innovator's dilemma and in the disruptive innovation theory that was introduced by Clayton Christensen. And the examples that he used in his book of some companies and industries where this was observed. One of them was the excavator market, where the old technology were excavators that were using pulleys and steam engines and cables. And performance at that time was measured by how big each scoop can hold. So how many tons of material can you hold? And notice that these machines were very big and needed to have railroad tracks to move because they would sink in otherwise. But their technology was good. They were able to carry very big loads with each scoopful that they had. And initially, this is how it started, but later on, they were able to make improvements. And eventually, yes, still using cable technologies, they were able to build these huge machines, especially in mines and places like this, which were able to dig up and carry huge amounts of material. And then some people argued, well, rather than using this cable technology, what if we use hydraulics to power our excavators? Well, the problem was that initially the hydraulic and the pressure that it was able to hold wasn't very big. And as a result, they could only build excavators which were relatively small and which could dig relatively small holes and have relatively small capacities, where one might, dig up tons or tens of tons with each scoop. This excavator mounted onto the back of a tractor could dig relatively small holes, and rather than tons, maybe tens or hundreds of kilos of capacity only. So when they asked their customers, the existing incumbents, dominant companies, when they went to their customers and said, hey, should I work on developing this new hydraulic technology for my excavators? Because, they're not stupid. They see this coming, but the problem is that the technology isn't good. So the existing customers said, hey, does it increase our capacity, our ability to dig? And they said, no, it's actually lower than what I can give you with cables. And so they said, hey, don't waste your money. Don't develop this. It's not good for us. So, continue to develop the cable technology. So it was new, small other companies which continued to work on the hydraulic technology-based excavators, while the old ones continued with their cable technologies. And again, the problem was that the companies that were using excavators at the time were not interested in these machines. So what these new companies needed to do was find customers that were willing to buy their new, smaller, lower capacity, lower performance excavators. But these excavators had another characteristic, which the big mining companies didn't care for too much. Because they were relatively smaller and lighter, they could be put onto more mobile things like tractors, onto the backs of tractors. And as a result, they were much more maneuverable. You could get them more easily into small spaces. So they ended up trying to find some customers which didn't care about performance of capacity, of how big a scoop it could hold, but they cared more about mobility, about being able to get into small spaces and dig relatively small trenches. So they went to contractors, people that were building new homes, and they typically were digging all of those holes from the houses they built to the side of the street for sewage, for cables, for this and that. They were doing this by hand. They weren't using excavators because they were too big, too expensive. But the new technology, smaller technology, actually wasn't a disadvantage for them. The smaller weight and the smaller capacity, all they wanted was to dig down a couple of feet and relatively narrow trenches to be able to use in their businesses. So these customers, which did not exist initially, they found them, they discovered them, and they started to sell to them. And that was how they were able to survive, by finding new customers, paying significantly less money for these smaller excavators. But here's where the disruption starts to occur. Over time, with technology, the capacity of these hydraulic excavators began to increase more and more, until finally they were able to develop excavators of huge sizes, comparable to the cable technologies. And as a result, even the big high side, performance side of the market began to be taken over by hydraulic-based excavators. So this is one of the industries that Christensen mentions in his book, in his research. Some others are about steel production, the big steel melting plants, huge investments, huge footprints, continuous need to operate continuously, versus arc reactor furnaces, mini mills, which initially could only produce steel of relatively low quality. And as a result, whereas this is high quality steel used in automotive and other production, but they couldn't do this, at least not initially. What they could do were I-beams and rebar, which is used in construction, but these are cheap, whereas flat steel is very expensive. So the big old steel mills focused on the flat steel, whereas the arc furnaces began to produce this cheap steel. But over time, with technology, they developed, they improved their quality, and eventually today, Most of the steel production is done not just in the big steel mills. Most of those have gone bankrupt. A lot of it is done by using arc furnace technologies and using recycled steel to produce new high quality steel as well. And then computer and hard disks are the last example, which I will briefly mention. But yes, initially, what you see in this picture is 5 megabytes of hard disk. And so this is it getting transferred via airplane. And yes, just 5 megabytes, not gigabytes, not terabytes, megabytes of data. And this is the technology from before, punch cards. This was the hard disk, basically. Then magnetic tapes, then these, I forget their name, but then coming to this is the 5 megabytes that we had been showing. And again, here, this is the hard disk, and this is the computer itself. And it changes over time. And later it continued to make improvements, getting smaller and smaller and smaller. But with each generation changing from one to the next, the technology performance was measured by speed and how much capacity those hard disks had. The problem was when you switched from one to a smaller size each time, typically what happened was that the capacity would go down initially. So it was an inferior product. So the existing companies didn't really want it. They just wanted more capacity or speed. And that wasn't what they were getting by the smaller sizes. But some other companies, the smaller size and sometimes smaller electricity consumption were important for some other companies. So from going from mainframes to mini computers to desktops to laptops to iPhones and stuff like this, each generation wanted some other performance measures from the products as well. And initially, they weren't the big, good customers. Initially, they were simply customers, though, that said, okay, I don't care too much about capacity. Tell me about size. Tell me about electricity consumption. And especially for laptops and for smartphones and devices like that, size and electricity usage, improvements in those were more important than just capacity. But over time, capacity also improved with technology. And they disrupted the markets. And what Christensen had found was that each generation from one to the next, typically the old companies went bankrupt. And it was newly established companies which tended to dominate the next generation of hard disks as well. Just like the floppies, which you may have been able to see. Okay, so yes, disruption examples used in his book. And so what about it? Well, disruptive innovation is one of those types of innovations which large companies tend to fail at, is the argument that Christensen brings. So innovation at large companies, we tend to think of large companies very successful, very big, very technologically advanced, but many of these large companies are more like dinosaurs. They're slow, they're bureaucratic, and so on. Whereas startups tend to be very nimble, very small, very rapid, consuming very little resources, able to survive with relatively small markets. So they typically attack at the lower side of the market where it doesn't interest these large companies because it's too small or not profitable enough for them. And these small companies, startups are able to survive and even thrive in these small markets, but eventually they don't stay small. If they become successful, they grow and grow and grow until sometimes they beat out the old dinosaurs and themselves become the big dominant companies in these markets. So how about entrepreneurship and academia and universities? What about them? Well, there's an argument that universities are also having to change, having to evolve. And definitely to survive, we need to do different new things as well. And one argument is that the third generation university, sometimes also called the entrepreneurial university, is having to evolve. For what reasons? Again, it's to be able to compete with innovations which are taking place and be able to also innovate ourselves. So we need to do the same things to stay alive. Because just because we're big and successful right now doesn't mean we will be able to continue to be big and successful in the future. So value creation has been an added factor or target objective for universities. And in his book, Towards the Third Generation University, Professor Wisema argues that right now we are seeing the third generation of the university model. The first generation, examples, University of Paris and University of Bologna. This is in 1088, 1158, 1,000 years ago almost, that we start to see the first examples of universities. And they had one objective, that was education, finding the truth and defending the truth, the method of instruction, that they were producing professionals. So for the bureaucracy, for the state, medium of instruction was Latin, and then for a long time this was the only type of university that we had. It wasn't until the 1800s, so 1810 in particular, where the first second generation university started to be established, which was the University of Berlin. Today its name is Humboldt University. And here, in addition to education, a second objective was introduced, which was research. So discovering and understanding nature also became one of the things which we wanted our universities to do. And our current structure of monodisciplinary, each department is focused on one area. And in addition to professionals, producing scientists, academicians and scientists to help find new things was introduced. And so then the number of universities began to grow a lot after the 1800s, and the research university was introduced and became very successful. And it wasn't until the mid-1900s that we start to see another generational shift. First examples of this were Stanford University and Cambridge University, which, in addition to education and research, a third objective was introduced of know-how exploitation, of generating their own revenues as well. So creating value, not just creating knowledge and education and science, but we gave our universities also the objective of generating value out of what they were doing as well, because the old resources were drying up. So to continue to be successful, the universities began to also find a way to be able to generate value out of the research that they were conducting and what they were doing. So in addition to generating professionals and scientists, now we also said the universities should generate entrepreneurs from their graduates, from their faculty, and also help entrepreneurs establish new companies and startups and technologies. So this is where we're at. And not all universities obviously switch from one generation to the next. And in Turkey, I would probably argue that we don't really have a total third generation university. If any, ODTÜ typically comes up at the top of the entrepreneurial university rankings. I don't think even we are third generation. We're probably maybe 2.5. Okay, a lot of it is research university based, but some things are done to head towards the entrepreneurial university as well. So what is an entrepreneurial university supposed to be doing? Well, help the mind change and adopt to a system where entrepreneurship is important, develop the skills and the understanding of its faculty, of its students, teach entrepreneurship, among the things that we do, like in my courses, and to generate entrepreneurs, from both its graduates and from some of its faculty members undertaking research. Help entrepreneurs develop their products and companies, and itself also needs to act entrepreneurially, being able to adapt to changing conditions. For example, in the future, we will probably see a lot more competition, and not just from other universities. We might see some universities from other countries come into the Turkish market as well, but we're also going to see some companies that are not universities become big competitors to us as well, like Udemy or Udacity, because some companies are going to say, I don't care about the diploma that much, as long as you learn what to do. In that case, our competitors aren't just going to be other universities which give diplomas. So we're going to have to adapt to this as well. What kind of things do we do at METU? You can check these out. You can follow us on Twitter and other places as well. But we educate, we have competitions, we bring in entrepreneurs, and we visit other places, and we do a lot of things to help the entrepreneurship ecosystem develop. And that brings to an end my presentation on entrepreneurship. I hope you now believe that, yes, entrepreneurship is important, that it's valuable, and that you will come back and look at the other presentations as well. Have a good day.